Tonight, as the Israel-Gaza War rages, tensions are boiling over on Australian streets. Is our social cohesion fraying? And how do we de-escalate tensions and restore respect? Is the two-state solution still possible? Joining our panel, Mark Leibler, lawyer and national chairman of the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Dave Sharma, former Australian ambassador to Israel and former Liberal MP for Wentworth. Francesca Albanese, UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Tim Watts, Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs. And Nasser Mashni, President of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. I want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we are meeting. Before we start the program tonight, a few words on this moment in our national debate. We've made the decision to conduct tonight's difficult and sensitive discussion without a live studio audience. We believe in your right to ask questions, and that is a right we will always defend. Tonight, our panellists will hear your questions through video link as we explore an issue rocking our diaspora Jewish and Arab communities. We will conduct a robust, healthy and respectful debate without hearing from each other. We are weaker. And because of the nature of this topic, we'll be canvassing some confronting material. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. Please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a video question from Daniel Lowinger.
Do those who are calling for a ceasefire mean to also include the hostages and their safe return, women, children and all? And if they do, why do they never mention them? I'm asking for 240 friends.
Francesca.
Would you like me to comment on the hostages?
I mean, he raises the question of the 240 hostages that are not often in all of the demands or chants. Should they be?
It depends on whose demands you are referring to, because at the international level, for example, I mean, from the United Nations system, the demand has been there since the very beginning. Both the Secretary General, all UN agencies, UN Special Rapporteurs have condemned the crimes committed by Hamas on the 7th of October against Israeli civilians, and killing civilians and taking civilian hostages is a war crime. And I've always, I mean, every time I point to the brutality of what's happening in Gaza, to the inferno that Gaza has been turned into, I always refer to the Palestinians and to the hostages who are there, because both of them are trapped in an inescapable situation.
So can there be a ceasefire without the return of all of the hostages?
There should be a ceasefire.
But can you have a ceasefire without the return of all the hostages is the question.
I think that the two questions go together, but in order, there should be a ceasefire because the situation is beyond catastrophe.
But that's where there's an issue, isn't there? Because for the Israeli community, they say, we want our hostages back before a ceasefire should be countenanced.
Well, there have been, as far as I understand, and you know we are in a very volatile situation, and not every piece of information can be verified. So I rely on what comes from the United Nations on the ground, and there have been several communications that apparently come from the de facto authority, Hamas in Gaza, who has referred to the release of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. And there is, I mean, this is where I agree with you, not listening to each other make us weaker. There is no question that the hostages must return safe and sound to their homes, especially, you know, what has I think, what has been incredible for many of us working with Israeli human rights organizations is that the portion of the population that has been affected the most are people who have been also fighting against apartheid, recognizing the importance of coexistence, and I mean this is critical. It's a tragic moment.
Yeah, all civilians deserve safety. I suppose the question is to you, Mark. If all of the hostages are released, should Israel agree to a ceasefire?
Well, ultimately, I think it's a question of all the hostages being released and also Hamas infrastructure being dismantled, because otherwise we're going to have another little Holocaust like we had on October the 7th. It's going to be repeated again and again and again. I mean, Hamas are quite honest about this. Hamas have said quite explicitly, we are going to repeat this again and again until Israel's destroyed. So it seems to me, really, the first step needs to be to dismantle Hamas. And
so the release of the hostages isn't enough?
No, I don't think it's enough, because otherwise it'll start all over again. Look, you know, I agree with what our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said. She published a piece in The Guardian and she made the point that in order to get peace and in order to have a two-state solution, you've got to dismantle Hamas. You will never, ever... I'm a great believer in a two-state solution, by the way, for a whole lot of reasons that we can go into at the appropriate time. But at the same time, I believe it's impossible. The best way to promote a two-state solution is to get rid of a terrorist entity that is running the Gaza Strip.
I want to go to Tim on that in a moment, but just on Penny Wong, you say you agree with what Penny Wong said. Yeah. She's been criticised over the last day for saying a statement around taking steps towards a ceasefire. Do you support the way she framed that?
I think it's been clarified recently by both her and the Prime Minister that they're not resiling from the fact that they're not calling a ceasefire at this point in time, because that would be like handing Hamas a gift.
Tim Watts, would you like to see a ceasefire, or has Penny Wong begun the steps towards calling for one?
Well, PK, there are very difficult issues that all governments around the world need to weigh up here, and that's why we've set out a principled approach. We've said that the humanitarian situation in Gaza at the moment is just so unbearably dire that we need immediate action to address that humanitarian situation. That's why we've been calling for humanitarian pauses, so that we can get sustained, unimpeded, safe humanitarian access to Gaza.
Yeah, but if I can take you to my question, is Penny Wong taking us towards a call for a ceasefire? Is this the step before?
Well, what I'm saying is that the call for a humanitarian pause is a necessary first step, but clearly much more needs to be done. That's why we've been talking about, you know, everyone wants to see us taking those next steps towards a ceasefire. But she's made it clear that that is not a one-sided process. That requires two sides to engage in that process. And
is the release of all of the...
Well, yes, the release of
all of the hostages, would that be the preconditions for a ceasefire?
What we have said is that there needs to be the release of the hostages. Hamas needs to stop its rocket attacks on Israel. It needs to stop using civilians in Gaza as human shields. And for a durable peace in the region, we need to dismantle Hamas. We can't have a durable peace with Palestinians and Israelis coexisting in prosperity, in security, side by side, in internationally agreed borders, without dismantling Hamas.
Nasser, at all of these demonstrations, and you've been part of them, big demonstrations, the one in Melbourne over the weekend was very large. The call is for a ceasefire, but there's not a call very often for all of the hostages to be released. Is that a demand that you think needs to be met before that can be considered?
Patricia, I think we need to go back to the reality that this is not a 35-day-old conflict. Everything we're talking about here is frames as October 7 is the start. The reality, Patricia, is I'm an accidental Australian. My father was ethnically cleansed by Jewish terror gangs in the late 40s. Israel hadn't even begun to exist yet. 1948, he was ethnically cleansed before that.
So you're talking about the Nakba,
the Nakba,
as it's referred to, but what I'm asking you about is this chapter of this
Patricia,
particular conflict.
Framing is so important because that's 60 years before Hamas. Israel, as a settler colony, has a problem with the indigenous people. Israel's got a Palestinian problem, not a Hamas problem. If Hamas was wiped out tomorrow, if the hostages went back, nothing's going to change. The settlers are happening. Imagine a world without Hamas. That's the West Bank. We've got the PA, full security control. The Israeli authorities call up the PA, the Palestinian police leave. They go in on Saturday, 5 boys under 14 were shot and killed.
We're going to get to all of those issues, Nasser, but respectfully, I've asked the panellists to answer the question, so I'm going to ask you as well. The question was in relation to the release of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire. Is that something you think should happen?
So we're right here. The hostages should be released, as should Palestinian
Can you understand why Israel would be reluctant for a ceasefire if their hostages are still being held in tunnels?
Well, what I want to look at is the amount of blood that's in the streets. Palestinian corpses are being eaten by dogs. If we can't say 5,000 Palestinian children have died in 35 days and say, first of all, let's stop killing kids. Let's stop killing. That can't be too big an ask of humanity. For 35 days, there's been no food, no water, no gas, no electricity, no medicine.
But should there be the release of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire?
Palestinian children matter too.
But that's not the question I asked, Nasser. I asked, should there be
I want the
release...
hostages to be released. I'm not a Hamas spokesman. I'm an Australian citizen.
No, but some people have accused you of being sympathetic to Hamas. Are you?
I'm not sympathetic to Hamas, but I'm certainly not sympathetic to the State of Israel and what's going on today in Palestine.
Do you think Hamas is a terror organisation?
I'm an Australian citizen. My government has prescribed Hamas as a terrorist organisation. It's not up to me as an Australian citizen to have be a spokesman for the Palestinians or for Palestinian armed groups. The reality is we are living a misery, an apocalypse. UN experts, not Francesca, but others, are starting to talk about this being a genocide. 1 in 100 people by the end of this will have died in Gaza. 1% of the population, that's 260,000 people.
They are warning about a potential genocide. In fact, I've interviewed you about this. Yes. In the Hamas manifesto, a genocide is called for of Israelis, of Jewish people, right?
When I hear Hamas leaders speaking and I hear Israeli military and political leaders speaking these days, I do not hear much difference. The level of dehumanization of the other, because there is a genocidal call that, I mean, Palestinians have been dehumanized through and through. They have been called animals. They've been. It was said that no. It's on record. It was said that no civilians are in Gaza. They are all part of the problem because they could have toppled Hamas. And again, this is totally decontextualized because the Palestinians in Gaza during the Arab Spring and after have tried to topple Hamas. So let me add 2 elements here.
Briefly, I just want to get to Dave.
First of all, until a couple of months ago, various members of the Israeli cabinet have been on record saying that Hamas was an asset and the Palestinian Authority was a liability. And even Ehud Barak, I was on a panel where he was invited, and he was saying this has been a feature of subsequent Netanyahu's cabinet. But one aside of it, the point is that you ask questions about the ceasefire in exchange of hostages. No, I mean, the two go together from a humane point of view. But from a legal point of view, we are outside what is permitted under international law because Israel, the response that Israel has given is in terms of self-defense under international law, the UN Charter, that, sorry, doesn't apply here.
Okay. Dave Sharma.
Well, absolutely, the hostages should be released. I mean, bear in mind there's, I think, 239 still being held. Only 4 have been released. There are multiple nationalities. I mean, there's 25 Thai agricultural workers, amongst others, that are being held. Taking of hostages is a clear war crime, as was Hamas's attacks on Israel of the 7th of October. So I think releasing of the hostages is necessary, but it's also not sufficient. I think the only way we get to a more hopeful future for both Israelis and Palestinians and towards a 2-state solution, which I also support, is if Hamas is ousted from political power and no longer has the ability to threaten Israel. I mean, we had a spokesperson from Hamas's political bureau, Ghazi Hamid, speaking on Lebanese TV just a few weeks ago, 24th of October, saying there will be a second 7th of October attack and a third and a fourth until Israel is exterminated or Israel is annihilated. It is impossible for either Gazan Palestinians or Israelis to live in peace whilst Hamas remains in political power in Gaza.
Now I'd like to go to a question from Eamon.
Question to Sharma. Dave, you have been to Gaza before. You know everyone there is not Hamas. You have met them. You have seen them in your own eyes. You know my dead sister is not Hamas. That my other sister is still trapped in Gaza is not Hamas. And you are a father too. You have children. How many more dead Gaza kids is okay? How can you sleep at night continuing to support this disproportionate attack that is literally killing thousands of innocent children like my nieces and nephew?
Dave, the question is essentially, is the attack disproportionate? There are so many children dying. Is it disproportionate?
Well, firstly, I'd say it's been terrible to see the loss of life. I have been to Gaza many times. I've, had lunches in families' homes there. I know some Gazan Palestinians personally, and I mourn for their losses. It's been a terrible tragedy to see. I think it's every loss of innocent life on either side of this conflict is awful. I'm not here as a spokesperson for the Israeli government, and nor am I here as a spokesperson. I'm not a Jewish Australian. I'm here as someone who's served in the region and knows both sides of this conflict. And war is a terrible thing, but we have to remember how this began, which was the October 7th terrorist attacks. I mean, people call for a ceasefire. As Hillary Clinton pointed out last week, there was a ceasefire before the 7th of October until Hamas breached it. Hamas came in through the fence, it slaughtered children in their homes, it killed parents in front of their children, it raped, abducted, murdered, defiled any number of people. This is how this conflict started. And of course, what's unfolding is a tragedy now, but until Hamas is ousted from political power, I don't see a way to resolve this absent. You leave them there, there will be further bloodshed, further loss of life and further conflict.
Patricia, can I address a little bit of that issue?
I prefer to just ask Tim a question because I just want to get the government's position on this. Penny Wong, our foreign minister, her assistant minister, said don't bomb hospitals and basically said it wasn't acceptable. Do you believe what's going on is a war crime?
Well, let me just begin by saying, PK, that we've seen a harrowing loss of life in Gaza, including far too many children. And this needs to stop. The Australian government has supported Israel's right to self-defence. We've also made it very clear that the way it exercises that right matters, and particularly it matters that Israel complies with international humanitarian law. So we call on Israel to honour its commitment to uphold international humanitarian law.
So you don't think it's honouring international humanitarian law?
Well, hospitals are protected under international humanitarian law.
So is that a war crime in your view?
Medical doctors are protected, patients are protected. There are a number of principles of international humanitarian law.
And have they been breached? Because you're not really answering it. Well, have they been breached?
PK, what I'm articulating are the principles here. So other principles of international humanitarian law are proportionality, distinction, precaution. It's obligated on Israel to take all feasible measures to distinguish between civilians and military targets, and to take steps to protect civilian life and civilian infrastructure. We have been very clear in setting those standards, setting those principles, and communicating them to Israel. They're in no doubt about our position and the position of the international community on this. Yeah,
Mark, obviously there are concerns. You saw huge rallies on the weekends. People are concerned that it is disproportionate. Can you understand the community concerns around this?
Of course I can understand the community concerns not because it's disproportionate, but, every life is sacrosanct. And it doesn't matter whether it's 1 or 10,000. It's absolutely shocking to see these deaths. It's absolutely shocking. And there are war crimes being committed that are leading to these deaths. War crimes clearly committed by Hamas. I mean, they're the ones who are... when you look at this picture, what you see is that Hamas is actually more important to kill Palestinians than it is to kill Israelis. That's something you've got to bear in mind, because every Palestinian that dies gives them the opportunity to blame Israel. Look, for example, Israel has told the Palestinians, given them the opportunity to get out of harm's way. It's given them warnings. It's sent leaflets around the place.
But it is hard to get out though, Mark.
It is definitely hard.
Most people say there's no safe place.
There's there's safer places and less safe places. I think that's fair comment. But the bottom line is that they're stopping them from getting out. They're putting up blockades to stop them from going. Now, for the first time, they've been able in Shifa Hospital to facilitate the removal of patients there with the cooperation of the hospital only because Hamas, has been removed from the scene. This is the huge tragedy. It's a shocking tragedy. Every life is important. And my view is that the only way this is going to stop is through the removal of Hamas, because otherwise you're going to have this loss of life again and again and again.
Now, so that is the main argument that's being put, that
before
Hamas
we get anywhere near that argument, I mean...
Well, do you agree, though, that Hamas will do this again?
Palestinians are killed. We're then blamed for our death, and then in our death we're smeared. There's no sanctity to a Palestinian life when an Israeli advocate speaks on a Palestinian death. It's outrageous that 5,000 Palestinians have died, and we're still talking about whether or not we should stop the blood. Should the hostages be released? I've already spoken about that. The thing we are not talking about is the context, Patricia. For 17 years before October 7, the daily calorific intake of the amount of food that's required in there was calculated by Israel, and only that much food goes in. It's a medieval siege, 500 trucks a day. In the 35 days since, less than 500 trucks have been in. We should have had 17,000 trucks if things were normal. Now ask yourself, why is trucks of food being delivered to a captive civilian population? As David Cameron described it when he was Prime Minister, an open-air prison. The reality is that whilst Israel denies Palestinians hope, we've got to work towards a better tomorrow. This land is Abraham's land. I'm half Muslim and half Christian. Mark is Jewish. That dirt calls for all of us.
Well, it's interesting you said that, because earlier, I've got to say, you said that we're Palestinians are indigenous to the land.
Of course.
Absolutely. Some Palestinians are absolutely indigenous to the land, but there are Israelis and Jewish people who are also indigenous to the land.
Palestinians don't deny Jewish indigeneity.
Actually,
we just don't think it's
some
superior.
of the movement at the moment that we're seeing does actually suggest that they're a settler colony which is at odds with being indigenous, isn't it?
So Jewish connection and the Zionist enterprise of the State of Israel today are two separate connections. The desire for a Jewish homeland, I get it. I've got 100 years of
So you support a Jewish state?
I support a Jewish homeland. The anti-Semitism that drove the need for a Jewish homeland is a Western construct.
But not a state.
Mark, I didn't interrupt you once. The Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, the pogroms, all that was all Western Europe. A Jewish homeland, absolutely. As a Palestinian, I want a Palestinian homeland. But a Jewish homeland that says all Palestinians it has to be at the expense of all Palestinians. And when I say all Palestinians, my grandchildren when they come along, etc. Not only does it have to be a Jewish homeland at the expense of all Palestinians, but at the continued oppression of every Palestinian.
So you're opposed to a majority Jewish state?
I'm opposed to inequality. Today we have an apartheid state between the river and the sea. Half the population is free and half isn't. We need to move to a situation. In South Africa, we never contemplated two states, a black state and a white state.
Arab Israelis do vote. They get elected to the Knesset. There is actually
70 rules, 70 laws that say they are second-class citizens. The number one rule is the 2018 nation-state law that says self-determination is available for the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone. That precludes the Druze, the Samaritans, the Muslims, the Christians. The Jewish people alone, there's inequality. We got rid of apartheid South Africa. We didn't get rid of South Africa. We need to get rid of apartheid in Palestine, Israel. Okay. Everybody should be free from the river to the sea.
Now, if this discussion is raising any difficulties for you or anyone you know, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14 and Kids Helpline is 1800 55 1800. Both those are on the screen. Now, here's a question from Sharon Mason.
Hamas rejects the recognition of the State of Israel and calls the liberation of all Palestinian territories, viewing the establishment of the State of Israel as illegitimate. Their charter also advocates armed resistance as a means to achieve its goals, including the use of violence against civilians. Does Palestinian territories mean Gaza and the West Bank, or does it mean all of Israel? from the river to the sea.
I'm going to let you pick up where you ended because it's exactly on the same theme.
Oh, fantastic, thank you.
We hear from the river to the sea. It's one of the slogans of the movement calling for a ceasefire.
Of course.
Does the river to the sea mean you want to eradicate Israel?
From the river to the sea means we want to eradicate a system of apartheid. It does not mean we want to eradicate any Jewish people or any Israeli nationality or anything like that. It's about making sure everybody is free from the river to the sea.
Okay.
To that point, she spoke about Palestinians recognising. In 1993, Palestine recognised Israel. 30 years ago, 5 years later, we were supposed to have a state. Mark's late brother was on the front page of The Australian with my father, and there was a peace in the Middle East. That was 25 years ago that we're supposed to have a state, let alone 30 years ago when that White House lawn handshake happened.
That's incredible history. I want to bring you in, Mark. That question from Sharon, you heard Nasser's answer there, that it's not about the destruction of or moving Jews out of that area or Israelis out of that area. Look, but you hear it differently?
Yeah, look, I think we've just got to be honest about this. I mean, if Israel didn't have a strong state, then the fate of the Jews who lived in Israel would be exactly what happened on the 7th of October.
I don't accept that at all.
Well,
that's a racist construct.
Let Mark finish now. Same rules.
Okay. So that's for starters. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Both Francesca and Nasser have made it clear that in their view, Israel's got no right to exist as a state. It's a...
I'll come to you in a moment.
And she said that explicitly. And not only that, it's been accompanied by a fair bit of anti-Semitism at the same time. Because when you start talking about, you know, the Jewish lobby manipulating the United States, and you start talking about, you know, 70 years of occupation, well, it's not occupation post the 1967 war. They're talking about 75 years of occupation. Now, there's no room for a state of Israel, and they should be upfront about it instead of sort of, you know, talking about apartheid and talking about all these other things. Let me tell you something interesting about all these protests that have been taking place, and it's worthwhile watching. Look, and if you want to know where we're coming from, look at the Jewish protests and look at the Palestinian protests. When you look at the Jewish protests, you will see what's taking place. They're praying for the release of the captives. They're singing the Israeli national anthem in solidarity with the Israelis. They are praying for peace. They're praying for their brethren in Israel. By the way, they don't hold rallies in the city because they're being told by the police that it's unsafe to do so. Now look at the pro-Palestinian rallies and bear this in mind. The first rallies, and particularly the one that caused all the problems in Sydney, was before Israel had been anywhere near Gaza. Before Israel had been anywhere near Gaza. Gas the Jews, F the Jews, and a few other choice things were taking place. Israel, Jewish people, they believe in the sanctity of Jewish life. You know, it's interesting.
That's a pretty good run.
Even I mean, he's called when it comes to terrorists, do you see Jews walking around with banners saying, destroy Hamas, destroy Hamas? They don't do it.
That means Mark, you're doing a pretty good job.
I'll just let Francesca go next, and then I do have another question.
Yeah, simply because...
Let me finish. They don't. This is not something which is in line with Jewish tradition. And what do the Palestinians do? Whether it's 9/11 or 7th of October, they hand out lollies and they celebrate when people are hacked to death. I don't know. But that happens to be a fact. It's a reality.
As a Palestinian, he's besmirching our entire people. I think...
Nasser, I'm going to come to you.
Okay.
I'm trying... Let's honestly, deep breaths. Deep breaths, and I hope the country's having one too. I'll let you talk, and then I'll come to you, and then we'll come to the next question.
Yeah, you invite us to speak in the spirit of respect, and I have to push back on what I just heard, which I find inappropriate and disrespectful, because I was surreptitiously accused of anti-Semitism, which is something that has been addressed and clear by Jewish scholars and Jewish communities around the world who has stood in my defense when these allegations were made. And I don't think this is the venue to reopen that. But also, there is such a level of dehumanization of the other, and which is, again, and there are two things here. I hear speaking of what Hamas has done as war crimes, which is totally fair, and again, I've condemned that as such. When it comes to the killing of Palestinians, this is tragedy. No, sorry, these are war crimes, and to an extent, under international law, this might amount to crimes against humanity, because so is intentional starvation and intentional extermination. The other thing is that I don't know which reality we are listening to, but there are people, including medical organizations, artist organizations, which are calling for wiping out Gaza, erasing Gaza from earth. And while this is happening in Gaza, many Israelis are calling, especially the armed settlers in the West Bank, for a second Nakba. So they have never recognized the Nakba in the first place, and now they are calling for a second Nakba. I mean, do we hear this? And again, and when it comes to here in Australia, let's say there is still this very disturbing pro-Palestinian versus pro-Israeli, when I think it's really the time to look at the shared humanity. I come from realities, and really recently in the UK and in the United States, where it was at the forefront of the protest, the Jewish community. And not just Jewish Voices for Peace. There has never been such a mobilization. They were crying, "Not in my name," and from the river to the sea.
There is diversity in all of the communities, is the truth, and all ethnic communities have diversity, like our mainstream community has.
So,
you wanted to write
I think necessarily, because when that sort of language is used by someone as eminent as Mark, that
what particular language?
Celebration of death, that it's culturally, that we're angry, that our protests are, almost bloodthirsty. We're coming back to that. We're killed, we're blamed, we're smeared. The reality is what we have is 75 years of oppression, 75 years of denial. Palestinians are human beings too. We have rights like everybody else to live in peace and sanctity. What we're asking for is a movement that is not racist. There is no place for Islamophobia, for anti-Semitism, for homophobia, for any sort of hate. And we're looking for a tomorrow where we live together. There should be no reason that my children...
Do you support a two-state solution or one state?
The two-state solution ended a long time ago.
So you want a one-state solution?
I think we need to move to... We would never have proposed a two-state solution in South Africa, Patricia. A black state and a white state. We can dismantle the apartheid system, as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and so many, Israel's own two foremost human rights organisations, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, both accuse Israel of apartheid. We need to move beyond a system that preferences some over others and make equality for all of us to be equal together. There should be no reason my children and Mark's children can't be friends.
Yeah.
It can't be just based on religion.
I want to go to the next question, if I can.
Before we go to the next, just one word, very simply this. Over the last 3 days at the Arab Summit, the President of Iran, Raisi, spoke. And you know what he said? He said, obviously, that Israel needs to be wiped off the face of the earth, needs to be destroyed. And what did he say? From the river to the sea.
Mark, it might surprise you, I'm not Iranian.
We all know.
I'm not Iranian. I'm an Australian.
But we all know.
Palestinians want to live in a free piece of land with you, Mark.
Nasser,
we want to live with you.
Nasser, we all know what that
we don't know.
means.
I don't know.
So you're saying it means something different to you, but let me put this to
Patricia,
you.
This is very
a lot
important,
of Jewish people hear it differently, Nasser.
Okay. So
you accept that they hear it differently.
I accept that they can hear it differently.
I can accept
that they hear it differently. And they're ascribing an intention on me. They're ascribing an intention on me.
Do you accept that that's an intention of others, perhaps?
It might be, but not on the vast majority of us. They're ascribing that intention. When right now, not the intention, Israel's actually committing that.
Okay.
Gaza is apocalyptic. Today, a cousin of mine, she was bombed in a house. She's sitting in a home with her 10-year-old dead daughter. She can't get her daughter out. They can't leave the house. She's decomposing with her daughter in the house, Patricia. That's not humane. If we can't call for a ceasefire, what are we doing?
Next, we'll hear from John Michael.
It's been reported that the charity co-founded by Nasser Mashni is sending money to a Gaza-based health organisation that is accused with being affiliated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a terror group known as PLFP. Please explain.
Nasser, it's quite obviously for you.
Yeah, no, obviously. Look, I don't want to go into too much, Patricia. We've engaged lawyers. Our lawyers have told us there is definitely action against Ms Marks and Sky News and the Australian for what they said, so I don't want to prejudice any outcome. What I will say is that since 2007 we've abided by every single Australian law. We've been audited, we follow the ACNC guidelines. I'm very proud of what we've done.
Are you sure none of that money is going to Hamas or to terror?
What I can tell you that we've abided by every single Australian law.
But can you be sure?
As I said, I'm not going to prejudice any sort of investigation, Patricia. But I want to talk about how proud I am that 400 orphans are looked after by Australian citizens. Sadly, we've lost 4 of them. 24 are missing. The orphanage has been partially hit. And these smear campaigns are really impacting our ability to help those.
But you are investigating it?
We'll comply with any investigation, of course.
But are you launching your own to find out?
Today, we can't even get a message to somebody in Gaza, Tricia.
Dave, is this something that happens, that people, contribute to aid, and can we be sure about where that aid money goes? That is often a question.
Well, look, it's undoubtedly true that Hamas has diverted assistance, humanitarian assistance given by well-intentioned people to support the Palestinian people and diverted it for military purposes. Food, fuel, cement, steel, building materials, precursors to weapons, precursors to missiles. This is the sort of entity we're dealing with. It is a terrorist organisation. It's a listed terrorist organisation.
But you're not talking about my charity, David, are you?
I don't know what your charity is, Nasser, so I'm not making any...
I asked him a broader question to be really clear.
Okay.
I did not ask him about your charity.
But, I mean, we've had situations where, the Australian government used to provide aid to an organisation called World Vision, which it appeared that allegations were made, which are now being investigated and prosecuted, that World Vision aid was being diverted to Hamas. And the truth is, Hamas is the sovereign entity in Gaza. They can do what they want, they can take what they want, they can tax who they want, they are uncontrolled, and so these things happen, unfortunately.
Tim, is that something the government's concerned about?
Well, let me begin by saying that Hamas is a listed terrorist organisation, that any donations or any financial contributions, fundraising that goes to Hamas is a very serious crime in Australia under Australian law. For Australians who are seeking to contribute to alleviating the humanitarian crisis that we see happening in Gaza, there's information on the DFAT website about trusted charities that they can contribute to, and that's the safest thing to do in the current environment. Visit the DFAT website and then you can see where you can help and be of comfortable mind.
Now, so there has been a range of stories about you in the last week. That's the elephant in the room. There have been people who've said that you should not be platformed because of those stories. One of them is about a crime you were involved in when you were younger, I understand. I believe that you've served time for it. People are raising questions around your role as a spokesperson. I would like to give you the opportunity to respond to those concerns around
Patricia, that was 35 years ago, and I can tell you that barely a night goes where I don't think about that day and the challenge. I think about the young man and his family. I think about what his life might have been, what my life might have been. I think about his family. I think about my father and my mother. And then I think about not just that day, but the orchestrated and concerted campaign over the past 2 weeks in so many mainstream media pieces to deplatform me. As today Australia's most outspoken advocate for Palestine. And it compounds that pain and says that, the act of a rash 19-year-old that many years later could possibly hurt me asking for kids not to be killed, that a message of a tomorrow that I dream that Mark's grandchildren and my children might live, that we would share a land that is attached to all of us, that we're all Christian, Muslim and Jew attached to Abraham's land, that those allegations that were in the newspapers and my criminal conviction could hurt that message. And it pains me no end. And I think it's really, really quite disturbing that such a concerted campaign has been levelled against me when all I want is for a better tomorrow, for the end of apartheid and for everybody to be free, Patricia.
Okay. I've got a question now from Michael John.
The Israeli government argues that Palestine has rejected numerous proposals for a two-state solution. If the Israeli government is committed to this, why does it incentivise settlements in the West Bank? Doesn't this undermine a two-state solution?
Mark Leibler.
Well, I think, first of all, settlements in the West Bank do undermine a two-state solution if you set up settlements in areas which would form part of a Palestinian state in the event that it was possible to establish one. I, for my part, believe that if you look at the settlement band around Jerusalem in that area there, I think it's fine to establish settlements there, but to establish more settlements throughout the country, the Israeli public is split on this. That happens to be my view. I don't believe they're contrary to international law. I think Israel's got every right to set up settlements, but
why does it have the right?
It's not. Well, why shouldn't Jews be able to live anywhere? Why shouldn't Jews be able to live?
But the Palestinians are arguing the same case. Wait a minute, it's my turn. The Palestinians are arguing the same case, right?
Yeah.
About their access to Israel.
Yeah.
So the same argument can be made. This is why it's vexed.
Well, I don't follow.
That's
point,
the area designated right now for the Palestinians.
Let me get to the essential point. The point that you need to understand is that settlements have got absolutely nothing to do with the issue of the two-state solution, because even if not a single settlement had been established, the offers made have all been rejected. I mean, you've had offers made which gave practically the whole of the West Bank and Gaza to the Palestinians, less a tiny little sliver of land, and that was going to be adjusted by swaps. They had almost everything they wanted, but they weren't interested. I mean,
I think they would contest that there is a competing narrative here, to be fair, Mark. That is not what they say.
Well, you need to have a look at what happened. Clinton
That's why I said it's a contested narrative. It really is. Yeah. Francesca?
So,
yeah, excuse me. Hillary Clinton is not a source of international law. And here, I mean, again, it's interesting how we shift from law to opinions.
Clinton, not Hillary.
Just for the people who are following us from home, settlements are considered a war crime under international law, violating Article 49 of the Geneva Convention, and in two ways, because they lead to the forcible transfer of the residents, which are Palestinians, owner of the land, and at the same time, they entail the transfer of the occupying power civilians into these settlements. Colonies are illegal, and they are recognized as the major obstacle to peace. There is even a UN Security Council resolution, Resolution 2334 of 2016, which reestablished this as if it was not clear enough. So again, 56 years ago and 40 years ago, Hamas was not there, and Israel was building settlement, and they are illegal, both in the West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem.
Dave?
I think I just should make a point here. I think, firstly, the settlements are unhelpful to a two-state solution and make it more difficult to realise. But I would also make the point that there were Israeli settlements in the Sinai Peninsula that were evacuated in exchange for peace with Egypt, the 1979 Egyptian peace treaty. There were settlers in Gaza until 2005, some 50,000 Israelis forcibly evacuated by the Israeli government. Undoubtedly, the settlements would need to be dealt with in any two-state solution, but I don't think that Israel has failed to show the political will to address this issue if it can be guaranteed a peaceful entity on its borders that recognises its right to exist, as happened with Jordan and with
So
Egypt.
the big question is, Mark, should a 12-year-old Palestinian child in the West Bank have the same rights as a 12-year-old Israeli child on the West Bank?
Yeah, why not?
But they don't.
Why not?
They don't at the moment as the law stands.
But are you talking about an Israeli citizen?
Well, this is the thing.
Yeah. You need to specify.
They're not Israeli citizens in the West Bank.
And that's why...
And they could be taken out of their bedrooms at 12.
By the way, you're 100% right. And that's why I believe very strongly in a two-state solution.
So you're opposed to that system, the way that it works right now?
I would prefer that Israel came to an accommodation with the Palestinians so that we end up with two states there. That seems to me to be a fair and reasonable way of dealing with this.
Francesca?
That's all that I'm saying.
And I wonder, if I may, sir, what's the reasonable arrangement that you are thinking of? What a two-state solution would look like? Because, for example, from a human rights perspective, I do not advocate for what happened to the settlers in the Gaza Strip. That was violent, and that has led to a further extremism. And so this is not a human rights way to deal with it. So would you, if a two-state solution finally happens, do you agree that the Israeli citizens who are now in the settlements, in the colonies, should become Palestinian citizens?
I would think that if there are Israeli citizens that are living there, there can be an option. You can leave Israeli settlements there, or alternatively, you can become Palestinian residents.
Subject of the Palestinian government.
Yeah, exactly. There are all sorts of potentialities. I think the critical thing, if we're going to have a two-state solution, is that Israel has to be able to deal with a Palestinian leadership that has all the attributes of the late President Sadat.
But in the West Bank, there is a different... The Palestinian Authority is responsible
fully
there.
That is right, but the answer is...
But there's two sets of rules still.
Yes.
Yeah, but you've got not only the West Bank, but you've got Gaza as well. Gaza hasn't been occupied since 2005.
It is
Mark,
occupied.
I mean, to say that Gaza
It's occupied.
is occupied is just an outright...
When you control the air, land and sea, work out how much food goes in. When you turn off the gas, medicine, electricity and water for 35 days, that's not a jail anymore, that's a slaughterhouse.
The only thing that Israel actually controls...
Australians know what self-defence looks like.
Let me finish your sentence. I'm coming in.
The only thing that Israel actually controls is the fuel and various other items
which is essential to running the joint, isn't it?
No.
Correct.
Which
every Palestinian child,
which can contribute to building more rockets. So it doesn't entirely stop fuel from coming in, but it does need to stop things coming in which can result... There's been over 40,000 rockets lobbed into Israel since 2005.
It's a war crime. It's a war crime.
Over 40,000.
There's been 5,000 children,
Mark. I'm just going
to... 5,000 children.
Yeah.
Nasser, what are you saying?
I'm going to say, Patricia, between the river and the sea, there's one controlling entity. The birth registry and death registry is controlled out of Tel Aviv. The birth registry of every Palestinian child's life, even in Gaza, is registered in Israel. The death is then registered in Israel. We all use the Israeli shekel. Borders, entry, exit, every level of every bit of control of every Palestinian's life. Not just in Israel and Palestine, here. When my father died, his dying wish was to be buried next to his mother in what's supposed to be a Palestinian state. When I called the Israeli embassy and said, what's the process of repatriation of a body to this two-state bit of Palestine, I was asked if he had an Israeli ID. I said, no, he's a pre-48 exilee. They hung the phone up on me, Patricia. Here we are, apartheid, not just for a Gazan child, not just for somebody, what we call 48 Palestinians or Arab Israelis, like a colleague of mine who had to get married via Zoom. And they live together in Australia. Because she's a Palestinian, she can't give her husband citizenship in Israel because she's not Jewish. It affected me, it affects her, it affects every single person.
Okay.
We ended apartheid in South Africa, we can do it in Palestine and Israel.
All right. I want to go to a question now from #TayAir.
I'm a proud Australian Palestinian, an entrepreneur and the owner of Burgatory, which burned down on Friday morning. I practiced my right to protest against the genocide that's happening in Gaza, a term Francesca Albanese said Israel is at risk of. The politicians and the media have polarised society in this country. The media was weaponised against me and other pro-Palestinian protesters for standing up against an injustice. My question is, how can we protect people standing up against injustices without the threat of being cancelled or defamed?
I want to go to you, Tim, because we've seen some pretty ugly scenes on Friday night in Caulfield. There have been, as the question asks, people, calls for people to be cancelled. I want your reflections on what's happening on our streets at the moment. We opened the show with that question. It's a key question. Are you concerned?
Well, it's worth reflecting on where we're sitting now, PK. I mean, there's no audience out here. There's a very significant police contingent out the front of the public broadcaster in Australia. I've not appeared on Q&A before and had to have security protection out the front. It's deeply concerning that this is the way we have to talk about this issue. Now, what happened in Caulfield was abhorrent and should never happen again. It's horrifying that in Australia, a country where people come from all around the world to experience the freedoms of a democratic society, that people would feel fear about attending a place of worship, practising their religion.
Of course.
That's horrifying. Now
in that synagogue, they were asked to leave. They were told they're not safe to continue staying in the synagogue.
So let me, look, the government's taken this very seriously. We've committed substantial amounts of money for security of places of worship, both for the Jewish community and for the Islamic and Palestinian communities. But I think we just need to have a bigger picture here and say that we need to disagree better in this country. Australia is a diverse, multicultural country. We can't progress just by talking to other people that agree with us. We've got to be able to have better conversations about things that we disagree on. And I think really importantly on that, we've got to get better at listening. Not just listening to get your next point for outrage, not just sort of, farming that resentment and anger, but listening with curiosity, not judgment. And this is something that I think we need to model as leaders, not just political leaders, but faith leaders, civil society leaders. And on that front, I do want to recognise that the organisers of the protest in Caulfield that caused that fear in that religious community have recognised they made a mistake. They've apologised. And in that spirit of disagreeing better, I want to recognise that. I want to celebrate that they've recognised that they've made a mistake. Because when I say that should never happen again, government can't do that. We'll do everything we can to prevent that happening again. But that's on all of us. That's on the Australian society, top to bottom.
Dave?
Look, could I just make the point, people have a legitimate right to political protest and to express their views and to express their mourning at the loss of Palestinian lives, their terror at the continued holding of hostages. But we've seen some of these actions cross the line quite considerably to demonise groups of fellow Australians, to threaten them, to intimidate them, to menace them. We've seen religious services at synagogues interrupted. We've seen Jewish-owned businesses boycotted and defaced. We've seen Israeli flags burnt in the streets. We've seen chants of death to the Jews and gas the Jews. That is not acceptable in Australia. It doesn't matter what your feelings are on this conflict, that is absolutely not acceptable. And to be honest, I think our political leaders here are failing to call this out as clearly as they should and to condemn it unreservedly. And our law enforcement is letting us down by allowing this to happen.
I've got to pick you up on that. Who's failing to condemn it?
All of our political leaders,
like who?
State and federal.
Name someone.
Well, look, I don't want to single her out, but Penny Wong asked about these protests in Caulfield, said it was good that they'd apologised. Well, yes, it was good they apologised, but it shouldn't have happened. She also said we shouldn't be seeing any Islamophobia either. I wasn't aware that there were any anti-Islamic sentiments expressed in Caulfield on that night. If there were, I condemn them as well. But when the line is crossed here, it's not there's a fault on all sides here. We need to call out the party that is crossing that line.
Right. I think we need to talk about the businessman. He owns 15 different shops. He went to a protest and went free Palestine. His social media was attacked. 2 and a bit weeks ago, the campaign started in that store. People were running into that store, yelling at shop assistants, 15, 16, 17-year-old girls and boys, how can you work for a terrorist? That culminates in an arson attack that the police have said...
The police are saying it's not a hate crime.
Yeah, exactly. They say it's not a hate crime, and they said it like quicker than any CSI TV show I've ever seen. But they said it was not a hate crime.
We can only at this stage, and I absolutely think reporters and others should ask more questions, but at this stage we take them on their word. It's not been declared a hate word.
Patricia, in the afternoon, there was a baying mob of Australian Jews with Israeli flags in front of that shop as if like a West Bank settler pogrom of clearing a village, reclaiming the dirt. Now those...
So what are you saying? Because when Mark used similar language, you were upset.
He can be upset. What I'm telling you is that the organisers of that rally went there to have an anti-racism rally. The chants at the rally were very, very clear about...
Do you think it was acceptable to go to Caulfield?
I haven't seen protests descending on Canberra.
Let me ask the question. Do you think it's acceptable to go to the suburb of Caulfield?
Caulfield's in Australia. It's not in Israel. Everyone should be able to go anywhere they want.
I've got to challenge you now. So we all know, any Melburnian knows, that Caulfield is a highly Jewish suburb. To go to Caulfield to protest...
Patricia, we should ask Muslim students at Caulfield campus of Monash how they're going to the shops in Caulfield.
So I just want to get some clarity from you, Nasser. Do you think it's okay to go and protest in Caulfield?
I don't think it's okay to go and protest. I think they can have an anti-racism vigil.
It wasn't an anti-racism vigil.
They apologised.
This is a euphemistic way to describe what was something quite shocking.
David, they went along...
Can I just say...
Well, I'll let Nasser finish and then I will come to you.
They went along to pray, to chant some anti-racism chants.
In Caulfield, and you think that's okay?
I think it's again, I'm hoping, Patricia, for a better tomorrow. Can we not agree that as Australians we should be having conversations, we should be talking about a space where we're all together?
Yeah, Jewish people were terrified in Caulfield after that night.
And I'm sorry, the people apologised. I didn't organise the rally.
No.
Our rallies have been well attended by tens of thousands of people, millions of people now.
But you're saying it's okay to go to Caulfield, it's just part of Australia though?
Well, it should be okay, shouldn't it? Shouldn't it be okay, Patricia?
I just asked the question in reverse. Would we think it's okay for a mob chanting anti-Islamic...
But I'm saying it should be okay.
No, but I'm just asking...
It should be okay to chant, of course not.
Let's conduct a thought experiment. If a mob went carrying Israeli flags, chanting slogans to Friday prayers at Lakemba Mosque or somewhere like that, would we not think that was provocative? I certainly would. I would certainly condemn it and I would call it out and say...
It's provocative either side where there's a Mark wanted to speak.
I just wanted to say one word. Pogrom. I mean, Nasser, I don't know if you know what that word means. You accused the Jews there of engaging in a pogrom. Do you know what you were saying?
I know
exactly
what is happening in the West Bank.
Do you know what was involved in
I know exactly what's happening in the West Bank.
Do you know how many thousands,
I know what Ben Gvir, the minister,
have been killed in pogroms? And you say pogrom.
I know what's happening in Hawara. I know 2 Palestinian villages in the West Bank have been depopulated since the 7th of October, Mark. 2 Palestinian villages.
But it's a very specific, Nasser, it's a very specific word. You did use it. Why did you use it?
Look,
and I'll tell you, you mentioned Hawara. So let me be very clear about this. What happened there was outrageous. I condemn it 100%. The people who were responsible ought to be brought to trial. You cannot bring yourself to condemn Hamas. You've been asked, I don't know how many times, why on earth can't you say, I condemn Hamas?
Well, can you? I don't know. Is that something you've done?
Well, he was asked 6 times on TV and refused to do so.
Let's address the question.
What I have a challenge with is that the condemning Hamas here immediately makes everything about the 7th of October. It says to me, Nasser Mashni, an Australian citizen, not a spokesperson for Hamas, that if I want to get on the ride, the merry-go-round that is acceptable discourse, I've got to condemn Hamas. Patricia, if you went back to my interviews after 16 and think, I've done interviews where I have condemned Hamas.
So because you don't want to be, I just want to get some clarity here, because you don't want to be on what you call the merry-go-round, you won't do it. I can't accept a narrative where I'm getting lectured by a lawyer on what is acceptable discourse. Isn't it just standard that you would anyone would condemn an attack on civilians.
I condemn the attack. I condemn an attack on any civilian, whether the death is by a masked gunman or an Air Force pilot dropping a bomb.
But that's not the question. It's about the Hamas gunman. By having to raise other things, what it does is you make it generalised when a specific question is asked.
Patricia, the challenge as Palestinians is that it doesn't matter how much we condemn, what we've condemned and who we condemn, we still get demonised, dehumanised, smeared for our own deaths. There was no Hamas when my father was ethnically cleansed. There is no Hamas in the West Bank. Israel's killed 200 people since the 7th of October in the West Bank, 250 since the 1st of January. It's not about Hamas. Israel's got a Palestinian problem, not a Hamas problem. If Hamas disappeared today, and let me tell you, Patricia, if there was a button, I'd push it. I'd push it just to give Mark that comfort. But they won't stop killing us. They're not going to give us Palestinians a chance to have self-determination and freedom, to allow my children to return to their ancestral villages.
Okay.
They wouldn't let my father get buried.
To Dave.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, there are a few people in this country with a longer record of fighting racial and religious prejudice in this country than Penny Wong. Yeah. Penny Wong absolutely and unequivocally condemned anti-Semitism and Islamophobia during this whole period. Anyone that seeks to undermine her credibility on this issue is frankly seeking to confect difference at this point.
It doesn't make her immune from criticism. I'm sorry, but her public comments are open for criticism and political debate.
We are actually entirely out of time, but you are going to have to come back again and have more of this conversation. I would love to say that we won't need to have it again, but I suspect we will. Thank you all for joining us. That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Mark Leibler, Dave Sharma, Francesca Albanese, Tim Watts and Nasser Mashni. And thank you for sharing your stories and your questions. Next week, I'll be with you live from Sydney. Head to our website to register to be in the audience. Good night.